Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Aleksey, Keith Preston, and Florian. And today's discussion is going to be about the current crisis on the border with Texas and the U.S. federal government, which is an extension of Greg Abbott's broader Lone Star operation. So, what I'll sort of start with is a sort of a framing device. There was an interesting video that I watched just today, which was by Texas Border Theater. I think it was by a channel called Beyond the News or something. And they interviewed this guy named Todd Miller, and he said, "Well, a lot of this is just theater. Like it's an election year. Greg Abbott supports Trump. This isn't really meant. This is meant to help. Trump's campaign more broadly and a more MAGA conservative insurgency more broadly." Now, this is something you'll hear with what you might call the more intelligent leftists. So this guy, but then also Keith, you had us listen to Kyle Kalinske, and they're both saying, well, no, Biden is restricting the border. But you see, there's a kind of element that I don't really buy here. Because on the one hand, you can sort of make that case because, well, these other left-wing advocates might want no border. And so if they want no border, then of course Biden wants too much of a border because he wants a border at all. But that's not the same as his restrictions being as rigorous as Abbott's or Trump's. So there's something about that I don't terribly find convincing. The other thing that I find to be incredible too is, again, when did the left become pro-immigration? In 2016, Bernie Sanders told Ezra Klein open borders was a Koch brothers conspiracy. I mean, granted, he's since got the memo. That was 8 years ago. But I think what's really interesting here is that this shows us that the modern American political left, the Liberal Party, the Democrats, whatever, are in no meaningful sense historically left-wing at all. This is ultimately just, if anything, it's the left wing of capital. So like the original unions in the United States, the AFL and the Knights of Labor, both supported the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and both supported the 1924 Immigration Act. Why? Well, because it would if you brought all these immigrants in, it would crash the value of labor. And so that was a classic leftist talking point all the way down. I mean, it wasn't even, you could say, well, those were white nativists. Well, then you have Cesar Chavez, who was organized down in the Southwest. He also wanted to restrict immigration because he says you can't organize workers when they can just import them over the border. So this was what the left had represented as an organized movement since its inception back in the middle of the 19th century. And this is a complete, total about-face. And I think what's really interesting about this crisis is how it shows that the American liberal establishment is just a global of shills. They're not at all what they purport to represent or be. And I think that I think is the really interesting aspect about all this, and that they show themselves to be completely insincere and fraudulent, even though, I mean, I remember growing up, in the aughts, hearing, liberals and Democrats from the 90s talk about the dangers of NAFTA, the old left, the far left. And that all led up to 2011 and Occupy, and then there was a big changing of the guard afterwards, which we've talked about in other videos. And so I think for me, again, that's the really interesting part of this border crisis. Now, is it theater? Is it something, more than what it seems? On the one hand, that does seem plausible. So I'm sympathetic to Todd Miller's position that this could just be theater. But as we've seen with Hamas in October of last year, right, at one point, the Likud party viewed Hamas as an asset because it helped break the control of Fatah over the Gaza Palestinians. So from their point of view, this wasn't like, this was all kind of a theater. But it doesn't mean the theater can't blow up in your face and Hamas invades Israel and kidnaps 150 people, starting one of the largest conflicts in recent history for Israel. So even if it is a theater, it doesn't necessarily mean it can't escalate out into something else. I think it's also interesting that it's Texas that's doing this, because Texas, in many ways, of all the, let's say, the polar opposite of California in the sense of its rhetoric. California's rhetoric is we're all pro-immigrant, we're pro all that. And Texas is like, no, we're not. And then you've got Arizona and New Mexico, which are just a good deal smaller, but still red states. And the other thing you'll hear too, and then I'll give it on to you, Keith. A lot of these liberal authors will be very disingenuous. They'll be like, well, look, why do we have all these people crossing the border? Well, it's downstream of all these effects of NAFTA, which uprooted, Mexican communities. So we should just let them in. Okay, on the one hand, that's okay. Let's give them that and say that this is the result of 30 years of U.S. economic policy in Mexico. To that, okay, well then the answer isn't to say, okay, well then we're just going to let them flood the borders. I mean, could one have imagined Lenin saying that? Well, yeah, immigration is a result of capital, so let's just let Russia have no borders. That's like the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You still have to address the problem at every level. And again, I think this whole incident just highlights how the modern American left is just not left in any meaningful sense at all. Keith.
Well, the main issue here, I think, has to do with the question of what are the United States' actual policies when it comes to immigration. I gave a talk probably about 12 years ago to the National Policy Institute where I talked about the wide range of interests in the United States that benefit from mass immigration. And that includes a lot of different things. Obviously, it includes employers who view immigrants as a source of labor. It includes state bureaucrats who see immigrants as constituents for their services. It can be everything from public assistance to public schools and virtually any service the government provides. And that in turn creates job security for the bureaucrats who manage these institutions. Also, the Democratic Party has for at least 20 years, if not longer, probably longer than that, has had a strategy of what Peter Brimelow called electing a new people, and that's the idea that the Democrats would secure a permanent political monopoly for themselves by importing large numbers of people from other places that are likely to be permanent Democratic Party constituents. Whether it's going to work out that way is a separate question, but that seems to have been a long-standing Democratic Party strategy. You also have ethnic lobbies that want to increase their own membership and their own the size of their own constituent groups. That's true of many different ethnic groups. You find churches that view immigrants as a source of converts or new parishioners, particularly since a lot of churches are hemorrhaging membership. You also find many other kinds of interests that have some kind of stake in having large scale immigration. One is merely ideological. You see many people from the liberal to progressive to left end of the spectrum who will say that, well, any limitation on immigration is by itself racist or discriminatory or something like that. On the far fringes, you have people who say there shouldn't be national borders at all because on the grounds that borders are just arbitrary lines on a map somewhere. So who cares if somebody crosses them? Now, as far as what the government's policies are, it seems to be somewhat schizophrenic because all of the kinds of interest I just described are certainly present and impact immigration policy. But then you also have other interests that are in favor of immigration restriction for a range of reasons, cultural reasons, economic reasons, whatever. Also, immigration enforcement is itself profitable for some private interests that, for example, receive government contracts to build detention centers or sectors of the bureaucracy that are engaged in immigration enforcement or for whom immigration enforcement indirectly impacts their economic livelihood in some way. So you have an array of interests that have a stake in either one, in either immigration enforcement or neglecting immigration enforcement. And a lot of the debate over immigration policy seems to be a push pull between these different assorted interests, some of whom have a hand in both camps. You have, for example, on the Republican side, you have interests that have a stake in one hand restricting immigration because they have, say, business interest in the construction of facilities associated with immigration enforcement. When on the other hand, they may have a parallel hand in businesses that profit from the employment of illegal immigrant labor. There are people who work both ends against the middle. Now, the question is, what is the government serious about, and as far as actual policy? If the United States was serious about enforcing the rules against illegal immigration, they would have a policy more like the one that Eisenhower implemented back in the 1950s. He called it Operation Wetback. I mean, obviously, you couldn't call it that now. That would be an unwoke or un-PC term. But Eisenhower, who at the time was considered a moderate Republican, was well to the right of Donald Trump on immigration policy. And there was a large scale deportation of probably millions of illegal immigrants in the 1950s under Eisenhower. And it would be theoretically possible to have something like that done today, just like the idea of the wall. I mean, it's theoretically possible the United States could simply build something like the Great Wall of China or the Berlin Wall along the U.S. southern border. Now, that would be expensive and time consuming, but it could be done if the political will for that was present. But there's no evidence that there is a political will for that. If there was, we'd see a lot more progress towards something like that. And if hardline anti-immigration people really got their way, that might be what we have. But I don't think they really have that much influence. I think that the Republican Party likes to play to that as a rhetorical weapon and as an electoral strategy, but I don't think they're serious about it. I don't think the elite sectors that control the Republican Party are that serious about restricting immigration, except for when they can work both ends against the middle, because so many of them have a stake in businesses that profit from illegal immigration. And there's other issues as well. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, on the progressive end of the spectrum, it's pretty clear that many people from that vantage point simply think there shouldn't be immigration enforcement at all. If you watch news channels that are liberal or progressive dominated, whenever they talk about border issues or border security issues, it's clear that they don't think border enforcement is really a legitimate enterprise. Now, they may not go so far as to completely shut down the borders, border enforcement altogether. They may say, well, no, we still should have passports, and we still need to make sure that members of ISIS aren't coming across the border. So they may not take it that far, so far as to simply say that crossing the border is like crossing the street, although there are people that believe that too. But I get the impression that most progressives nowadays really just think there shouldn't be immigration enforcement. Now, for them to have their way, the way you would have to do it would be to have all of North America or even the entire Western Hemisphere be something like the Schengen zone, where the Schengen zone is a block of nations in Europe where technically they're different countries, but there's no borders between them as far as citizens of the different countries are concerned, meaning that if you're, say, if you're born a citizen of, say, the Netherlands, then you can go to France and work in France. And it's no different than, say, if you're born in Virginia and go to work in Maryland or something like that. So, I think that's really what most progressives want. I think in the long run, they want to see the borders between the United States and Mexico and probably the Latin American countries generally to be simply abolished, and the Western Hemisphere would be something like the Schengen zone. And it's not just because they think borders are racist or something like that. I think it's also a lot of economic interests who want to have a kind of EU in the Western Hemisphere or Schengen zone in the Western Hemisphere. So obviously these are irreconcilable views. If somebody who advocates a genuine crackdown on border security on one hand, is somebody who would probably want something like the Great Wall of China on the border. And then the people who want, something like the Schengen zone from the Western Hemisphere, these points of view can't be reconciled. And that's who tends to dominate the discourse. that's who tends to really dominate the discussion, I think, at least in as far as the implications of the different views. Opinion polls show that most Americans are somewhere in the middle. They don't want to totally abolish the borders. They don't want to have a Berlin Wall, crackdown on illegal immigration either. The thing is, the moderate position may be the one that's the least achievable, because if you want to have a full-on crackdown, you probably could have something like, the Berlin Wall, the Great Wall of China on the Mexican border. Domestically, you could have something like, Reagan's war on drugs in the 80s, only it would be a war on immigration, illegal immigration, where you have mass arrests and deportations of illegal immigrants, or people facilitating illegal immigration. Employers, for example, who employ illegal immigrants under the table or whatever. I don't know that many Americans really would want that. I think that in today's political climate, that would be denounced as fascist or racist or something like that. I also think that most Americans don't really want to totally do away with the borders either. I think that, a lot of Americans look at it, well, no, we've got to have controls on who's coming in the country. Not just terrorists, but also people who might be carrying, communicable diseases, or, and then there's also concerns about cultural preservation. But with the kind of in-between system we have now, I don't really think either side is going to get their way, and it's not really possible to have. It's not really possible to restrict immigration unless you go all the way. Like to really restrict illegal immigration, you'd have to go all the way and have an Eisenhower-like policy from the 1950s. Or if you really want to have the kind of liberal, immigration policies that a lot of progressives are for, you'd have to go all the way and have something like the Schengen zone in the North America or Western Hemisphere. But as long as you've got this, hybrid system we have now, you're still going to have lots of people coming across the border because it's just too easy to do. There's too many people who want to cross the border. There are too many ways you can do that. And there's too many people in the domestic United States who are willing to facilitate that. So that's kind of where things stand.
Okay, Aleksey.
Well, there's much to be said here, though. I do find it interesting how the left, the so-called left nowadays, is not really left wing in a sense that it's aligned with the working class. Even Bernie Sanders changed this position from a traditional left-wing position to a pro-immigration left, and I'm wondering what is in it for them. What is in it for the people who want the open borders policy? Well, the obvious reason is this: that there was a need for political survival. This is how the Democrats intend to consolidate their position. It's well known that Democrats believe, many of them do, that voter ID laws are questionable, they're racist, or deplorable. So why that? Well, what is stopping people from voting illegally? What is stopping illegal immigrants from voting? Not a whole lot. So the logic of political survival dictates that it is in the best interest of the Democrats to have as many immigrants as possible, legal or otherwise. The Democrats are the tent party, which means that they're the party of anything that's not WASP. And the more illegal immigrants arrive, the more likely the Democrats are to receive votes, even if these people are not going to claim legal residency. I believe in the 1990s, Bill Clinton instituted the wet foot, dry foot policy for Cubans. When a Cuban arrives in Florida and he happens to set foot on American shores, he becomes the legal resident. And why is that? Well, why would Bill Clinton do something so stupid? In a sense, the Cubans are predominantly Republican. Why does he want more voters who are going to vote against his party? That doesn't make any sense. But there's a bigger picture. There's a deeper game here. That Bill, generally speaking, the game of NAFTA, the game of loose borders, will on a net whole benefit Democrats much more, even if some immigrant groups like Cubans will vote Republican overwhelmingly. And even then, not all of them do. But all right, so if given that Clinton accepted such a liberal immigration policy, well, no, with NAFTA, it would seem that it's simply a matter of political expediency to have as many of them as possible, to have as many newcomers as there could be. And of course, there are economic reasons for this, as we discussed. Jeb Bush is a proudly boasted of how his wife is Mexican, I believe, and how he is in favor of immigration, legal or otherwise, although he wouldn't put it so starkly. And the idea is simple. Well, these are new liberal and new conservative politicians who are in favor of the interests of big business and capital. Why not have a Hilot class, docile chattel to exploit? The world is rife with chattel. For Walmart to hire, for Walmart to exploit, for Walmart to hire illegal immigrants to stock shelves. What restaurant would not want to pay waiter no wages and just tips rather than do things by the book? What convenience store would not want to have that advantage? It's common sense as far as economics is concerned. It's also politically beneficial for the Democrats in terms of voting, in terms of their business interests. And of course, one other benefit of illegal immigration is that, well, you can contract them as maids, house sitters, babysitters, cleanup crew, maintenance. Why not? If you make $300,000 and you are a lobbyist in Washington D.C., why would you not want to have an opportunity to pay a maid $1,000 to take care of your children, $1,000 a month, when otherwise you would need to spend much more money with a legal employee? Now, I want to invoke one other idea that's particularly interesting. The United States, up until recently, had a rather restrictive immigration policy. However, Argentina is an example of a country that did not. Argentina traditionally has been very open to immigrants. When Hippolyte Yrigoyen came to power, for example, 1920s, even at that point, the doors, the floodgates were open. And what was the result of this? Well, the result of this is that there was an abundance of labor that's cheaply priced. And to be sure, Argentina did benefit from this to a point. Yet in the long run, it seems to me this is a formula for political instability. In the long term, unrestricted immigration contributes to the development of a polity that is rife with many kinds of factions that are perhaps not easily compatible with democracy. That's why there were so many coups and authoritarian takeovers, and up until recently, this nation of immigrants, Argentina, has been governed by military dictatorships up until 1982. 1980, 86, I would say, after they lost the Falkland War. And I'm wondering, all right, is it really the case that immigration contributes to political instability? After all, the United States is a very multicultural nation, and there people tend to segregate. People tend to segregate a great deal. And what about a country like Brazil or Argentina? Could they handle immigration better? Maybe it's more of a melting pot, perhaps, but it's always going to be a challenge. There are two structural economic challenges when it comes to unfettered immigration. First of all, it is human nature, no matter how tolerant the mainstream culture is, it is human nature for people to self-segregate and form ethnically homogeneous enclaves. That happens everywhere. And as a result, the social fabric will be eroded. It's going to be difficult to have a meaningful exchange of ideas because a large strand of the population will lack common values and common ground based on which they can form civic friendship, to use Aristotle's words. And the second notion is that, well, when you have a deeply entrenched oligarchy, as we now do in the US and as Argentina did, even before Peron and still does, the influx of cheap labor will benefit the interests of capital over that of the middle class. I do not believe it is a coincidence that this South American country that used to be one of the wealthiest has become one of the most stable and one of the least economically successful countries in the Western Hemisphere. I don't think it's a coincidence that they also had a very tolerant and a non-restrictive immigration policy. So I would say that as far as this democracy is concerned, as far as civil society is concerned, and then immigration has to be controlled, because at the very least, if it's unfettered and unrestricted completely, the middle class will get eroded. And Barrington Moore had it right. There is no bourgeois, there is no democracy. Think about what happened in Argentina in the 1940s. Peron's generous welfare state and an acceptance of all kinds of immigrants, even Nazis. And you may say, well, Peron was a fascist sympathizer, but that's not really why he accepted so many Nazis. They accepted all kinds of immigrants. And what happened? Well, in a matter of a decade and a half, the middle class has fallen upon hard times. And that, in a way, in economic terms, the Peron had a leftist policy, that he was for labor unions and he was for the welfare state. So that sounds like he was building the middle class and fighting the oligarchy. But what undermined and contradicted his narrative, his ideological position, was his open borders policy. That if you're for labor unions and you're for feminism and what have you, all right, as you are as a leftist of this sort, you may have been. Why would you be for open borders? That doesn't really have much coherence. And you wonder, what Mussolini have agreed with Peron's position on immigration? I rather doubt it. He accepted some Jewish refugees, but it's really not so much of a fascist position. It's not a right-wing position necessarily, but I imagine that it is certainly a position that's oriented toward capitalism. And Peron was very far from having been a capitalist, and I would say that, if anything, this seemingly benefited his cronies in big business much more so than his middle class supporters, who admired him for how he fought the oligarchy. And I would say that it's really not much of a surprise that economic chaos, military coups, poverty was a consequence of what was a nearly an inevitable entailment of this. And I gotta wonder if Enoch Powell was right in his declaration that unrestricted immigration creates rivers of blood in this. Rivers of blood as the most famous speech that he gave, where he said, "As I look ahead, I'm filled with foreboding, like the Roman. I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood." And it's hard to deny that every time a far left governor, left in that sense, in the modern sense, takes over and opens the floodgates to refugees, crime rates go up. Look at Chile. Every Chilean person I've talked to confirms the same point, that unrestricted influx of Venezuelan refugees drives up crime, and that's inevitable, because when there is no control over immigration, you never know what percentage of newcomers are going to be criminals. And then you can take a tolerant liberal point of view and say, well, most immigrants are decent people. They just want to work. They want to do jobs that nobody else wants to do. Fair enough. But what if 1 in 10? What if 1 in 20 is a serious problem. What if it's just 1 in 100? And imagine if 1 in 100 is a criminal, and you have 10 million people arriving. How many new criminals are arriving? And everyone is one too many. So, in summary, economic instability and crime and dissolution of democracy and civil society is an inevitable entailment of an unrestricted immigration policy.
Okay, yeah, lots of points. I think to what Aleksey just said is, I think the middle class is always the most vulnerable, because they don't have masses, like they don't have masses of people like the working class or poor people, but they don't have all the assets, right? So they don't have economic power. So I feel like almost like if the middle class isn't like secured or preserved by the government, they will really always, if there's large movements, they will always fall asunder. And in the end, you always have a two-pronged society where you have a top elite and like a large number of poor people and very little economic mobility. I think, and that's also true if you have lots of refugees coming in. You don't have like dentists from Norway that want to immigrate in the US all of a sudden, right? Those people don't immigrate into any other country because they are kind of okay where they are, right? It's always poorer people, and they're easier to manipulate. The general question, or the central overlapping question, is: are we looking at like an anti-white demographic replacement, or is it just an overall dilution of the economic power of societies, right? Because the value of labor becomes diluted. I always thought it's a general strategy of like that's connected to the wars in the Middle East as well. So what you do is you give those military contractors lots of money, and so then they go out and help the government, smash things to pieces in the Middle East, for lack of a better phrase. You create a lot of refugees, and those refugees are then going into like more richer countries that are not ravaged by war. As a result, the entire labor force, the entire value of the labor force gets diluted. So it's a double whammy for corporations. Not only do they get rich by selling military hardware, they also get rich because now the value of labor is low, so they don't need to pay people as much, right? And I think that's one of the cruel reasons why we still have wars in the Middle East, because like the international corporations, they will not hold back. They will not do the moral thing because they benefit from it, right? And since there's like maybe like 20, 30 overall different corporations in charge of the entire planet, then there's lots of collusion between military contractor and normal corporations that just sell like staples and stuff like that. And so since the middle class in many of the Western countries is predominantly white, like an unfettered immigration will lead to demographic replacement of the middle class. And this feels, if it was intended or not, like demographic replacement for white people. I think that's one way to see this. And I found it also interesting when Aleksey mentioned that Argentina has never really worked on restricting immigration, and realized that Milei also ran on the platform of he was fine with having more people immigrate if they provide good labor, right? So he was also not against immigration. That was not the platform he was running on, right? So it seems to be something that's like anchored in society after a certain amount of time, that the ruling class, they want to have more immigration, and there's very little incentive to do anything against it. On the other hand, Eisenhower, since I didn't even know that Operation Wetback was actually the deportation of people that were already in the country, that shows you clearly that if the political will is there, people can be deported back to where they came, right? And we see that in Afghanistan. It's embarrassing. I hope I don't get it in the wrong direction. But I think I think Pakistan deported a lot of Afghani immigrants over the last half a year. They basically had like 2.9 million Afghani immigrants they wanted to get rid of. And right now they have, in 6 months or so, they kicked out 1.4 million, and it's still ongoing. So it clearly is possible to deport immigrants back when they're already in the country. But of course, it becomes more difficult once these people are in the country, and then they start forming roots, right? After 5-10 years, then they are kind of like, for better or worse, part of the society in which they immigrated. So you have to nip the problem at the bud. One thing I was always asking myself, and I'm a bit surprised that the Operation Lone Star there was some talk about like, oh, civil war, recession. That talk seems to have subsided. It seems to be completely normal that the states do defy the supremacy clause and basically take immigration protection into their own hands. And the other part, the other flip side of the coin is, of course, imagine there's a new Trump administration. Trump has a second term. And then Arizona all of a sudden decides, you know what? We are making our own compact, and refugees are always welcome in Arizona. So Arizona just keeps the border open, right? So many on the right, and myself included, we didn't like what the Supreme Court decided with a 5-4 majority that the federal government does have the right, to go in and take the securing the border in their own hands. But it can go both ways, right? I think ultimately the government, the federal government, that's the duty of the federal government to secure the border. And if they don't secure the borders, the states will. But it's a two-sided sword, right? And I wonder whether there's any hint that could happen if Trump has a second term. We also talked about the progressives, that they really don't want immigration enforcement, right? And there's all these crises with immigrants being bussed into the big liberal cities, sanctuary cities, and New York basically breaks down under the additional cost of all the immigrants that are buzzed into that city from Texas. But in some cases, the immigrant problem can be very quickly be cleaned up. Like all the progressives in Martha's Vineyard, once a busload of immigrants arrived there, like a year ago, those immigrants were gone in half a week or even faster, right? But I do think there's some progressives who actually would open their doors. There's a bus dropping immigrants out, and there's a progressive middle class person. They will actually open their doors to immigrants. So some of the progressives are really believers, right? So the question is how much power they will have in any government. With Biden, they have more power. With Trump, they will have less. And ultimately, it's a question how much are they really matter when it comes to the neoconservatives, neoliberals that will most likely decide the question of how much immigration is allowed. I should add as a last point that Kyle Kulinski was talking about, he was criticizing Texas' efforts of closing the border, and he said there was a perfectly fine deal with immigration, that the Republicans and Democrats, they had a bipartisan agreement, but that agreement would have still allowed like 5,000 people to come across the border every day, right? And that's not what Texas and other states want, and that's not something that we as the United States should want. But I think Keith brought that up, that ultimately it may come down to something, that there's a steady trickle of 5,000 to 10,000 people per day, because there's just no political majority for a new Operation Wetback.
Okay, so we got a super chat, which I'm going to read soon, and I think this could stimulate a lot of discussion. So this will be kind of I guess I'll take it as our final thoughts, because we're already at the 40-minute mark anyhow. Death by cognitive dissonance, $20 US. Thank you very much. I predict the GOP will be the ones to grant mass amnesty to illegals in the U.S., likely before 2035. It's their only hope in securing a larger slice of the Latino population so as to remain electorally relevant thoughts. So the first thing I'll say is, I guess it depends on which GOP, right? If we're going to like throw this out 10 years to 2035, that all depends on if Trump wins this year in the election and if that solidifies a Trump MAGA constituency in the Republican Party. So, for example, Keith, you've predicted a long time ago that the neocons would switch back to their original Democratic roots, and they more or less have. One could imagine a future in which Trump wins in 2024, creates an established MAGA constituency in the Republican Party, and a lot of these rhinos just become Democrats, in which case the entire demographic nature of the GOP would change with regards to its political demographics. A lot of these rhinos that drag their feet might just leave. That's one possibility. And so if that happens, I think it's relatively unlikely that the GOP would support mass amnesty. In fact, that could be the basis for harsher, stricter border controls. And also a MAGA GOP could also be theoretically influenced by Haas's MAGA communism. I mean, you got Haas, Caleb Maupin, Jackson Hinkle. They're definitely playing to the MAGA base. And in that regard, communism's desire for closed borders would align with the middle-class Republicans' desire for closed borders. So, because I mean, those activist types are going to have no home with the rhinos. They're all appealing to the MAGAs. I mean, Caleb Maupin made that really clear during the Canadian trucker protest a couple of years back. So that's one possible reality. Now, if Trump loses and is arrested or just completely sidelined, and then the rhinos stay in power, maybe that could happen. That's assuming, that's assuming we'll have a functioning country in 2035 as well. So yeah, the underlying thrust of the question is, will the rhinos support amnesty? Yes, they will. But I think the real question is, will the GOP be run by rhinos? I'm not so sure. Okay, Keith, what is your answer or response to that super chat? Do you want me to show it up again on the screen? Keith?
Yeah, I tend to agree with the viewer, because here's why. It's certainly true that Donald Trump has had the effect of reviving a lot of pre-1980 traditions within American republicanism. For example, he, to some degree, revived the Eisenhower-Nixon populist tradition. He revived the Robert Taft isolationist tradition. He revived the 1920s model of sort of Main Street conservatism, Calvin Coolidge, Warren Harding, Herbert Hoover, that kind of stuff. He also revived the 19th century Know-Nothing tradition, which was a liberal Republican but anti-immigrant nativist movement in the antebellum period. These are all traditions in American political history that were once part of the Republican Party and were superseded by the Reaganites and neocons in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. But then Trump has had the effect of reviving a lot of that. But I also think that those traditions by themselves are not large enough to actually take over American society or even the Republican Party in toto. What those traditions have become is a faction within republicanism or within the American conservatism or within the Republican Party that I think serve the same function as, say, something like the National Assembly in France or the AFD in Germany, in the sense of being a conservative nationalist faction. If we had multiple parties in the United States, like you do in parliamentary states, then they would be a separate party. MAGA would be a separate party. It would be like Marine Le Pen's party or something like that. But because we only have this two-party system, they're sort of a party within a party. But they're not the dominant force in the Republican Party. Trump may be the most popular politician, but if you look at who actually controls the Republican Party in terms of their funding, their donor class, and the interests behind that, it's primarily a wide range of interests that could care less about the kind of nationalist, populist viewpoint that the MAGA people have. The Republican Party gets its funding from billionaires, many of whom profit from illegal immigration or legal immigration or both, and have no financial incentive to oppose immigration. For example, the Koch family is a major donor to the Republican Party. They're very pro-immigration. The other major interests behind the Republican Party tend to be a lot of Jewish billionaires who with strong Zionist views. Zionists tend to be tend to be pro-immigration because they view importation of non-European immigrants as a means of diluting whatever residual influence of European Christian anti-Semitism may be in the United States. The rest of the Republican Party's financial base are largely just business interests who only care about tax cuts, and a lot of those are pro-immigration as well because they see immigrants as a means of generating employees, new markets, consumers, and all of that. Even among the evangelicals, some of them that are older tend to be very conservative on immigration, but younger evangelical types, even those that are theologically very conservative, are also often pro-immigration. They see the immigrants as a new source of converts and a new source of parishioners for the church. So there's a whole lot of right-wing interests or conservative interests that are pro-immigration as well as anti-immigration. Also, as far as Trump himself, in my view, Trump's anti-immigration rhetoric is just that. It's a tool. It's something that he uses to play to a particular base or constituency he's created for himself. Whether he takes it seriously or not is a separate question, because Trump was a lifelong liberal Democrat until he decided he could run for president as a Republican successfully. He's on record as saying even since then that he wants to increase legal immigration. In fact, Ann Coulter, who was a conservative pundit, and she's a hardline anti-immigration person. She's like, that's her main issue. That's her thing, anti-immigration. She's totally turned against Trump, arguing that Trump's immigration restrictionist rhetoric is a total fraud, that Trump actually put very little effort into getting the border built and all of these kinds of things. It's just a tool he uses for his, to rally his base, but he doesn't take it so seriously. Also, I could very easily see Republicans being the ones to give amnesty to Latino illegal immigrants in the future. And a prototype for that is something that Trump did, which is called the First Step Act. Like the Trump administration implemented the First Step Act, which was a prison reform act that basically pardoned or gave amnesty or commuted the sentences of a lot of prisoners, mostly black men, who were viewed as being put in prison for excessive sentences for different kinds of offenses, drug offenses and stuff like that. And Trump signed this act into law. It was actually supported by Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, who was a major advisor to Trump. Also Mike Pence, who's sort of like the evangelical point man in the Trump administration. They were all in favor of this. And clearly the reason for it is to try to bring more blacks into the Republican Party as a constituent base. And I can certainly see that. And it's worked to some degree. Like Trump is a lot more popular among blacks than Republicans typically are. And I could certainly see an amnesty program being implemented by Republicans at some point in the future in order to increase the number of Republican voters, because the Democrats today are becoming the party of the upper class, or maybe the upper middle class. And the Republicans are becoming the working class party. But the poor and working class are disproportionately minorities. So you can't really have a working class party that that publicly hates minorities. That's a not really a winning strategy in the long run. So I suspect that in the future, Republicans are going to try to become more minority friendly, although at the same time they'll appeal to conservatives who are minorities. I mean, plenty of minorities are social conservatives. They're religious. They're against abortion. They're against the whole LGBT whatever configuration. They're some of them own businesses. They're economically conservative. Some of them are foreign policy conservatives. Some of them are against socialism because they come from countries where they've had a bad experience with socialism. So it's not like there are not minorities who are conservatives. They just don't like racism. All right, so if the Republicans, I think, will largely move towards trying to appeal to more people in those categories in the future, and an amnesty bill would be one way they might end up doing it. Now, that would offend the hardline immigration restrictionists in the Republican Party, but I think that they will probably fade in influence over time because of generational change. Because as older people, like the most hardcore anti-immigration people, tend to be older people, and as those die off, and as the number of conservative-minded white people shrink in population size demographically, there will be less of a constituency for hardline immigration restrictionism.
All right. Aleksey, your thoughts on the above super chat?
Well, what I find interesting is that Republicans have two conflicting commitments. The first point is that they're becoming the party of the working class, as Keith said. And to support the working class, you have to be concerned about the possibility of the erosion of wages. You would have to be careful about your immigration rhetoric. You would have to wonder, right? So if we create a society where there's an abundance of employees who are willing to work at a deplorably low wage, how can we still be a party of the middle class, a party of the working class? Then on the other hand, as Keith mentioned, that if Republicans are to remain the party of the working class, they will have to be more minority friendly, which means they have to soften their rhetoric on immigration. They would have to, at the same time, accept as many more immigrants, and at the same time, they have to be concerned about the possibility of living wages being eroded. These two commitments, to me, are irreconcilable. I would say that the Republicans will have to decide which way they want to go. Do they want to be a party of the white working class, and oppose immigration, or do they want to be a party of all working class people who, in a way that doesn't really stand up for the economic interests of any of them? To me, the more logical resolution to this problem is that Republicans will have to become a nativist party, and a party of identity politics, as much as the Democrats are. But they would have to be a party of the white majority. And that's the only way that they can be a true party of the working class, and they will have to oppose immigration much more stridently than does Donald Trump. While there will be some minorities will support Trump, and other anti-immigrant Republicans, they will always be the minority, and some of these supporters of the Republicans will be white adjacent. In short, I agree with Keith that it's not really a winning strategy in the long term to be a party of the lower working class, lower middle class, and at the same time oppose minorities. But that's the best that the Republicans can do, because if they start supporting minorities, that will fundamentally erode their position on the role of capital and the role of labor power being, and then their position regarding the necessity of restricting the labor pool. And so to answer the listener's question, I don't believe so. I'm skeptical. I do doubt that the Republicans will be a party that supports Latinos in ways that the Democrats. I would say that their first priority is to support the working class whites. It's the Republicans will stay a nativist party, and that's going to be the most definitive feature. If anything, the next Republican potential presidential candidate will be more rigid on immigration than Trump, not less. So all in all, I'd have to say that I disagree with that observation.
I was going to say, Florian, go ahead.
Yeah, interesting super chats here. We got also like two, one by death by cognitive dissonance and one by K. Lewis.
Well, let me read K. Lewis's real quick.
Okay.
For $5 thank you, K. Lewis. I don't believe there will be a MAGA coalition. The past two midterms show that only Trump can do MAGA. Norming republicanism is more popular than MAGA. Okay, so there you go, Florian. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So first, to I think it's always the GOP always has a hope of securing more of Latino population, and Keith was right. They have secured more Latinos, and Trump has secured more Latino support and more Black support. It was bigger in 2020 than it was in 2016 for the election, but they will never get. I mean, it's the numbers that Republicans would need. It's non-realistic. I mean, you will never get enough Latinos that support Republicans with mass amnesty. You know, they all start voting Democrats anyway. I think it's a fool's errand to do it. However, if you strengthen the industrial base in the U.S. and restrict immigration in that point, but elevate the working class in this country by having more jobs, then you might also get Latinos on your side, because and socially Latino families are anyway more socially conservative. I don't think Latinos are on board with all the woke stuff. I don't think that flies well with them. They have large families, and everything that's pro-family, that lets people earn more so that they can finance their families, that will get more Latinos on board than any mass amnesty. And also, I think there's also like an overarching necessity to get the manufacturing base back in the US. We have outsourced so much of our labor and of infrastructure. It all gets done in China, and this is dangerous. We can't let we don't want to have a situation where China has all the drone factories, and like they have a leg up on us in modern warfare or something like that, or like all the antibiotica and any drugs are all made in Asia. That's not an ideal solution either, right? We don't want to be dependent on a huge country like China, obviously, for our national security. And so I can see that a bolstering of national infrastructure and getting back industries that went into went into other countries by strengthening our own manufacturing base. That could be an argument where you would also say we restrict immigration because you want to strengthen everything in the US. And that would actually also get people better off. And then in the long run, that would be a way for the GOP to become more relevant. And I agree there with K. Lewis. It's difficult to have a MAGA coalition. Most normies state they want to have normal Republican. And most people, normies Republican is more popular than MAGA. But it's important to see that Trump has only been like the spearhead of MAGA. MAGA is more than just Trump. I mean, the people that are pro-MAGA, they would be pro-MAGA without Trump. So Trump was just someone who rode the wave. And there's a larger sentiment. The question is, will that sentiment further manifest? And I think it can. If the key word is, for example, strengthening our own manufacturing base. That is something you can get a lot of smart people behind, a lot of industries behind. That could be something that a MAGA coalition has more of a gets more of a political real estate into the future. So So I think doctoring about with like more or less immigration, that's not the way for the GOP to become more popular or to get more support from Latinos. I don't think that's the way. Creating new manufacturing in the US, that is a very strong way to make your party more more popular overall and get more political power.
All right. Thank you, Aleksey and Keith and Florian. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.